Well, that's a story in itself, which you may have heard, but it's a story that I tell often because it's a fairy tale by itself. I every summer my parents would take me to New York. That was our summer holiday. That was our vacation. And we would go to the theater. We would shop and just stand on Broadway. And we had a good time. And excuse me, I was entered in school, and this was July. I was going to school in September. And I knew a pianist in New York, a man I'd worked with actually at the Pittsburgh Playhouse when I was going there in the summers. And he, of course, in his own right, became a very famous writer. Ken Welch is his name, Ken and Mitzi Welch, who did the Carol Burnett show forever and ever and ever. And he had written a couple of musicals for the Playhouse. And of course, I'd worked with him, and he was a real, excuse me, a real sort of fan of mine and wanted to be my mentor and thought I had talent was what it was. And so I called him. He had an apartment in New York, and he said, "Come on over. We'll sing a couple of songs." And so I went over there, and we were singing away. And he had written a little song called "My Very First Kiss," which was a very sweet little, song, beautiful little ballad for a young girl, obviously. And he said, "Shirley," he said, "Rodgers and Hammerstein's casting director is having open auditions this week for anybody that wants to go in and audition for them." Because at that time, they had about 3 shows running on Broadway, at least. And their shows ran so long that they had to keep replacing chorus people in their shows. They would go on to do other things. And so they would hold open auditions at least once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. And anybody that wanted to sing could just come in off the street and sing for them. He said, "Why don't you try it? Why don't you see what happens?" And I said, I'd never been to a professional audition of any kind. I really was not a pro by a long shot. I'd done little theater, but in a very small town way, so, and I was very naive. And he said, "I think it'd be very good for you. Let's just give it a try, just see what happens." So he talked me into it, and I had, great, he was a marvelous, stable force for me at the time. So I said that I would do the audition, and I went down with my music. I had 3 songs prepared, and waited in line with everybody else. And finally came my turn, and I went in and I sang "My Very First Kiss," which is this little ballad he wrote for me. I sang "Lover," the song "Lover," in a very high soprano range, and then I sang "The Best Things in Life Are Free" as my sort of uptune. And the casting director, his name was John Fernley, I'll never forget, said, "Miss Jones, what have you done?" And I said, "Nothing." It really literally was that. And he said, "Well," he said, "Have you had any experience at all?" And I said, "No, just, high school productions and little theater productions at the Pittsburgh Playhouse." And he said, "Well, could you wait for a few moments?" He said, "Mr. Richard Rodgers just happens to be across the street rehearsing his orchestra for Oklahoma, which was about to open at City Center, another production of it, and then go out on another road tour. And Richard Rodgers had a habit of always rehearsing his orchestras, no matter where they were, himself, before they were sent out on the road. He would play the piano because he wanted his music, and he would conduct. He wanted his music perfect, the way he'd written it. He said, "I would like to have him come over and hear you sing." And I said, "Oh, okay." I wasn't even sure I knew who Richard Rodgers was, you understand, at this point. I said, "Okay." So a few minutes later, I'm standing in the theater, and in walks this man, and he said, "Miss Jones?" I said, "Yes." And I said, "What did you say your name was again?" And he said, "Richard Rodgers." "Oh, yes, of course. I'm so sorry." He never forgot that, by the way. So he said, again, "What have you done?" And I went through the whole thing. I sang for him, and he said, "Miss Jones, could you wait 20 minutes? I'm going to call Oscar Hammerstein at home and have him come and hear you. Now, it's my first audition." And Kenny, my pianist, said, "Shirley, I hate to tell you this, but I have an airplane to catch. I can't spend any more time here. I can't wait with you." And Richard Rodgers said, "Well, never mind. We have a full orchestra across the street. You can come and sing with the City Center Symphony." Well, I'd never heard a symphony, seen a symphony, let alone sing with one. Oscar Hammerstein arrived, and he had the score of Oklahoma with him. And he said, Miss Jones, do you know the score? And I said, well, I think I know the music, but I don't know the words. And of course, I'm talking to the lyricist, you understand. And he said, never mind, I have a score. He said, do you think you could come over across the street with us and sing Oklahoma? People will say we're in love, and oh, what a beautiful morning with the full City Center Symphony. I said, I guess so. And he took me across the street, holding the score in front of my face. I stood on the stage and sang with the symphony orchestra, the 3 songs. Well, my knees shaking, with the score in front of my face, I sang the 3 songs. And at that point in time, they both said, Mr. Rogers said, Miss Jones, we have a show that we would like you to go into the chorus of. It's a show called South Pacific. And he said, a young lady is leaving in a couple of weeks, and you can go down and look at the show and rehearse the show and go into the show. And I said, oh, well, and then at the same time he said, we have something in mind for you that we won't discuss with you now. But he said, there's something else we're thinking of. And I said, but I'm going to college in the fall. And he said, well, discuss it with your parents because we have a job for you. Well, I went, talked to my parents, and they decided I should get an agent in New York, And strangely enough, when I tell this story, because I was so hard on my kids when they said they wanted to go into show business, I said, no, you're going to college. What's the matter with you, And my parents were, and I'm an only child, were so tolerant. I mean, they said, Shirley, we understand how you feel, and we know that, you want to be a vet, and you're talking about that, but why don't you give it a try? Give it a try for a year and see what happens. You can always go to college. You can always go to school, which was very unusual, for parents to do at that time. And so I said, well, okay. Got an agent, and I went home, got my clothes. My parents brought me back. I stayed at the Barbizon Hotel for Women, met a young woman that I'd worked with in Pittsburgh, and we got a little apartment together on West 73rd Street for $75 a month, unheard of today. And I went and rehearsed South Pacific and went into South Pacific 2 weeks later as one of the nurses. And I had one line in the show. Everybody in South Pacific had a line. We weren't just singers and dancers. We could, we were actors as well, which was great because we made more money too. Each person made more money than if you were just singing. And my one line in the show was, "What's the trouble, knucklehead?" One of those. And it was the last 6 months of the Broadway company. And Mary Martin was not in the show. It was Martha Wright and George Britton in the show. And it was the last 6 months of the show. And it was a great, great experience for me. I mean, I got this little apartment, took the subway. This was 1950, let's see, three. And it was a great experience. In the meantime, when I was doing the show, the Rogers and Hammerstein office called my agent. My agent's name was Gus Schirmer, and he was of the Schirmer Music People. And he was really a mentor as well. He was a little tiny agent in New York, and called him and said, listen, we are now presently thinking of doing the production of Oklahoma as a motion picture. And we have Fred Zinnemann as our director and Arthur Hornblow Jr. as our producer. And we would like Shirley to come in and read and sing for the Hollywood people for the role of Laurie. Well, I prepared everything and went in and did my audition. And after the audition, they said it was a wonderful audition and all of that, but they said the Hollywood people felt that I was just too inexperienced to handle a major, major role in a major, major motion picture that was costing a fortune to make at that time. And Mike Todd was also involved because they were doing it in 2 different processes, CinemaScope and Todd AO. And so I went about my way, was in South Pacific when it closed, and was about to, go back to Smithton and go to college. And Richard Rogers said, Miss Jones, we have another production called Me and Juliet, which we would like you to go into in the role of Juliet, which was a featured part, and understudy the lead, which was then played by Isabel Bigley. And Bill Hayes was the male star, who you probably know from the soap opera, I think Days of Our Lives. And he said, and it's going on the road. You'll play a month here in New York, and then it's going to the Schubert in Chicago. And he said, you have one big song to sing, No Other Love Have I was my big song in the show, solo. So once again, here I am, not only not in the chorus anymore, but I'm understudying the lead and playing a role, in my second show. So I did that and went to Chicago with the show. And while I was in Chicago, in the meantime, they had screen tested and seen every young woman on both coasts for the role of Laurie in the movie. And while I was in Chicago, they called me again. They said, Miss Jones, we want to make a screen test of you for the role of Laurie. So I went from Chicago to Los Angeles, went out of the show. I screen tested with Gordon McRae, which was very unusual. He was already chosen to play the role of Curly. And Fred Zinnemann was directing the test, which is also unusual for me. And it couldn't have been a better thing to happen because he's such a fine director. And I had such a wonderful hand, for my first screen test. I tested, and I remember Fred Zinnemann said, have you ever acted before a camera before? And I said, no. I said, that's my first time. And he said, well, don't change anything. He said, you're a natural. And went back to Chicago, and 2 weeks later, my agent called and said, hello, Laurie. And that was how I got the role in Oklahoma. And that was within a year of my first Broadway audition. So it's an incredible story.